So I would like to open it up for questions, and you can direct them to one person, or you can probably have both of them respond as well. So go ahead, and if you could say where you're from also.
From New Rules. I agree with the paper, obviously, and I agree with a lot of the things that Mark brought up, because I don't think that the issue of having many capital controls on a global basis really interferes much in the system, and could be useful in the same way that sometimes the taxes can reduce some volatility. Perhaps some type of system of capital controls could also reduce that type of volatility. But having said that, I must sort of call out the attention that a change in position of IMF needs to be come together with a very clear description of what should not be done. Because it's very hard to decide what good things are in capital controls. But it should be very clearly spelled out from the very beginning, and that's not enough in that paper, of what should not be done. Because we see many of these capital control systems not having anything to do with economy and pure political influences, and those things have to be spelled out very clearly. And Mark knows very well what I'm referring to. And those things should be clearly on the spot. When they use capital control system, not for the economic purposes, but for totally different purposes, that is a no, and should be clearly spelled out and identified when that is happening, which is happening in some of our countries.
One of the concerns that I think one of the issues that we also struggle with is, I think, very much related to what you just said, that you may have a case where there is genuine economic reasons for considering some kind of a price-based measure, non-distortionary, effective, so forth. But in practice, it's often hard also to distinguish when something is being done for just economic reasons, or using such a measure is sort of a front for not doing something else.
Oh, you recognize it easily. The day it's told, you smell it immediately. No problem there.
But it is something that I think you're absolutely right, that one needs to keep very much in the forefront when thinking on a practical basis when some country might benefit from use of such controls.
Oh, and just another thing. I have over 35 years spoken very strongly for capital controls, but mostly on the inflows. Because to me, it's the inflows that most hurts an economy, because they totally distorts internally. And I think that there should be a sort of spell out that it's not only when the typical crisis, let's put it on the outflows, but it really, where it's most useful is when people least imagine them to be useful, which are the inflows. And I think that really should be concentrated a lot more, like the Chilean system that they had. It really served them well, and it was sad to see that in the trade agreements and all that, they had to take it out and things like that. It's a sad thing. But I do think that to spell it out on the because people normally think of capital controls, at least in our countries, on the outflows. And they're not used to think on the inflows. They're not used to think on that.
Other questions?
Could I, just a quick comment. Yeah, I do think the political considerations are often on the other side, that is the removal of the capital controls, where you have very powerful interests. And Joe Stiglitz pointed out a number of times, and by his reckoning at least, the U.S. government's pushing for removal of capital controls in the run-up to the Asian crisis was politically driven. It wasn't based on evidence that this would actually benefit the economy, but you had mutual funds and all kinds of financial interests that wanted to get in there, even though these countries had very high savings rates that didn't seem to even need the foreign capital. So I think that's a problem. Also, on the outflow side, I mean, I should have mentioned this earlier, but you have other examples of outflows that, China, for example, has long restricted. They've had a whole set of, and it's not mentioned very much in the literature, but China's had huge restrictions on capital inflows and outflows for decades, and they've also had the fastest growing economy in the history of the world. Nobody's even close to that. Well, I turned that off. Did. And so I think that's very important. In Russia, for example, is another example. In the late 90s, they used capital controls. It did stem some of the outflow. In the latest crisis, they didn't, and they lost hundreds of billions of dollars in reserves. And I don't believe that that was inevitable. I think there is a way to prevent that kind of money from leaving the country. Certainly the Chinese did. South Korea, they had at least potentially the death penalty for capital flight for many, many years, and they never killed anyone, but they did have pretty severe restrictions, and they did work. So it's been done, and it can be done. You need a certain level of administration, and you need institutions that are not corrupt, at least on that particular issue. I think it's going to be important.
So this is Paul Dolan. Do I understand that India has reasonably successfully been able to target equity or FDI type inflows and discourage inflows of hard currency debt? I'm not an expert on this, but I'm of, or at least I read that they were quite successful, and that was maybe part of the reason they weathered the current crisis quite well. Or is that anyway correct, or does anyone like to comment on it?
You can if you.
I unfortunately don't know enough about India to comment on it. Mavish, do you have anything you may want to add?
I think India has a pretty, they have pretty high capital controls, but they might be targeted towards debt liabilities and not as much on FDI, because FDI has been so, they have pretty stringent controls, but it's just that might not be targeted on FDI.
That's exactly what I was saying.
Yeah, but I'm
But
speculating.
is that is that a good thing? I mean, it seems to work pretty well for them.
Yeah, so but that's what Reza said in his presentation.
One part of this whole issue is the debate on capital account liberalization. And if we sort of take the clock back a little bit, right now we are talking about coping with inflows, but prior to this, papers were being written on the appropriate pace of capital account liberalization. So that is the perspective from which I see countries that still have controls on capital. Now, countries have moved and have wanted to move in the direction of liberalizing controls. Specifically on India, what I meant by saying, I do not know enough specifically is that I do not, since, we are a cross-cutting department, not the Indian department in the IMF, I am not the right person to share the assessment of whether this policy that is followed has, on balance, has been the right one. What I want to say is that, there is a reason why countries were moving and want to move towards capital account liberalization where the controls are very tight. And that is that, when we discuss about capital, at least to me, there might be a view that capital flows are evil. But that's not the way I think about the world. I mean, the way I think about capital flows is that they have benefits, and in certain cases they can have cost. And so if you are a potential recipient country of capital, then as a policymaker, you may want to think about how to maximize the benefits while containing the costs. There are a lot of countries right now, a lot of emerging markets right now, who wish they had this problem of capital inflows. There are countries right now which are constrained from financing, right? And therefore they're having to make hard choices. There are other countries which have an excess of this, right? So I just wanted to sort of bring that thought in that, you know, capital flows provide important sources of financing, of investment, of growth. They can become excessive, and they can be associated with sharp outflows. So the challenge that I see is not to get rid of, what's the expression, to throw the baby, you know, yeah. But to get, you know, to get what is useful and to watch out for what is, you know, risky. And that is, I think, at least, you know, the way I think of the presentation that I shared with you is, this presentation is geared towards, you know, advancing the debate on that issue. That how can emerging markets continue to benefit while, you know, containing the cost. I'll also tell you that, you know, it's a combination of push and pull factors. So I put up that chart on correlation between advanced economy liquidity and flows to emerging markets, right? But that's just would be a supply side factor, you know, the emergence of liquidity from advanced countries. It's not going to all emerging markets. It's only going where growth prospects are very good, right? So, you know, if you are, you know, Brazil, and I think you have great growth prospects, that's why the money is going there. So, you know, whereas in some other countries, you wish the money was coming to you and it's not. And so you're desperately searching, you know, for sources of financing. And there are now, you know, some famous countries, you know, some big countries which have, you know, so it's a bifurcated world out there right now.
Just a quick thing, you know, I haven't seen anything on India where it specifically says that they've increased foreign direct investment as a composition of inflows by their capital controls. But
well, no, I think it's more that they've discouraged inflows of hard currency debt flows.
yeah, well, that would be the same thing that
Yeah,
the
yeah.
FDR would.
But I think that is
increase
pretty clear, yeah.
But I know that China has definitely used capital controls to actually shape the composition of the foreign direct investment, and also to extract technology transfer from it. And so to use foreign investment the way they wanted to use it in their economic growth strategy, a very important part of their strategy. And so I think that's important. Just in terms of the, you know, people think the capital flows are evil. I don't think anyone's really made that argument. I mean, you know, Evo Morales denounces capitalism on a weekly basis, and even he hasn't said that capital flows per se are wrong, or that, you know, that government is getting foreign investment as well, especially in the extractive sectors. And I think that it's more a question of how much they need to be regulated. And I don't even see, I mean, it's really a continuum between the prudential regulations that almost everybody except the libertarians accept, from there to the, you know, unremunerated reserve requirements, taxes on inflow. It's really just the continuum we're talking about, and some flows are, for no sound economic reason that I can see, are put in the category as, well, no, those are bad, you know. But that's what I think needs to be broken down.
Richard, there is an issue of human rights hidden in the whole thing. And let me explain the following. When you allow someone, you always allow to stop someone entering your house. But it's not the same as stopping someone leaving their house. There's a dramatic difference there. In that sense, all the capital controls on the inflows do not really hurt me. It's really, I have too much right now, I can't use more, I cannot accept it. But capital controls, when it's on the outflow, is really keeping someone prisoner. So there is a notional difference between those two controls that should not be totally ignored. There are cases, and we have lived through regimes that where the capital exodus were actually what saved the countries, because there was so much inflows coming in from foreign investors that the locals didn't get remunerated. They took it out, and the day after the crisis, it was these local capitals that were outside that could return to the country and save it. So those things have to be analyzed in what it really means. Sometimes, it is very dynamic, but there's a big difference between the inflows and the outflows, even from human rights perspective.
Can I address that? Because I think that's an important point. I mean, I don't know if I would call it human rights. I mean,
Prisoner versus right.
well, first of all, it's not, it's not an expropriation that's taking place when if you have domestic currency and it's not freely convertible into foreign currency, so you can take it out of the country. That's not an expropriation, really. That's just it's a regulation, and I don't really see. I mean, I think the strongest argument would be perhaps when there's a drastic change in the rules of the game, and an investor comes in there with an agreement that they're, and that's part of the reason they're investing is that they have the right to, unrestricted right to repatriate their capital and their profits and whatever else, and then the rules change. That's maybe a stronger argument, but again, rules change all the time, and that's part of the capitalist system. That's why there's risk. That's why you get a profit, supposedly, in this system, because you're taking a risk, and that's part of the risk that you're taking. And so even that, to me, I wouldn't see as a human rights issue. If you don't want to take that risk, you don't have to go in there. It's not like the right to freedom of expression or the freedom of security in your person or even property. You're taking a chance when you go to another country and another system of laws and regulations, and within the United States. I mean, look, you could. I mean, if you're really a libertarian, you make the same argument about taxes. We're about to put a taxes on banks. They're screaming that it's going to hurt their profits. Well, if you're the Cato Institute, you call that an expropriation. And so I guess that's where I would go.
I was looking for, yeah.
I actually want to ask a question, if it's okay.
Absolutely.
Because I think many of us are interested in, now that we've seen the paper and there's some differences of opinion exactly about some of the finer points and some of the bigger points, but where does it go in terms of IMF loan agreements, future policy, advocacy work, press statements, things like that, especially with the second paper that came out that sort of had a little bit of a difference of opinion with the first one. How does that happen within the IMF, and what changes is that going to mean for policy?
Maybe I can talk a little bit about from the operational perspective of how these considerations are being reflected in IMF's work in countries. And let me divide the space of emerging markets between countries where we have programs right now where we are lending and those where we don't, but we are engaged in active exchange of views through our regular surveillance framework. If you look broadly at emerging markets and you see the last few months, the period where capital has been coming in, you actually do not see too many examples of countries which have introduced some kind of a price-based measure to deal with capital inflows so far. Right? So you have Brazil, which actually did something a while ago, but then you have had a lot of speculation. You had Taiwan, which did something, but beyond that, it's an issue that countries are facing, and this is an issue that we are engaged with, with country authorities. Now, typically, in a surveillance relationship, it's in fact, when I was in the Philippines, it was the same nature of a relationship. There was no lending going on. The relationship is that the IMF can offer advice, and what we appreciate is that the leverage, the only leverage, the real leverage that we have is the quality of the advice. If it is good advice, then we hope country authorities will follow it. And if they do not agree with the advice, they do not have to take it. Right? So, in this specific issue, our purpose, in part through a framework like this, is to remain engaged in a dialogue with country authorities on weighing the pros and cons of alternative options. To give you an example, this Venn diagram that we have, we did an internal exercise to see, based upon countries' characteristics as of now, doing exchange rate assessments that one can using available methodologies, looking at levels of reserves where they are, looking at where the economy was in the cyclical position, take about 50 or so emerging markets and see which countries might show up where, and you can do that. And it turns out that at this stage, you at least, when we made a cut, do not find too many countries that appear right at the intersection of all of that so far. And that's, in fact, also consistent with what has happened, as I mentioned a little while ago, that not too many countries have used such control. But this is, if the first chart I showed you about historical relationships, it holds for the future, then that suggests that these issues are going to continue. And so our goal would be, to remain engaged with country authorities to evaluate, options, and they will evolve. The exchange rate might not be, overvalued today, but, depending upon how much inflows come in. So there is, so that's what we seek to do on an ongoing basis. The way it then gets reflected would be, you would see discussion, for instance, in our Article 4 stock reports, which is the annual stock report that comes out for each country where we have a surveillance relationship of the discussion of issues that took place if that was relevant. The central message that I think, at least we have tried to convey, and Mark, you mentioned this, is that such measures can be, they are a part of the policy toolkit. So what's useful is to think about when is the right time to use it. This framework is one from an economic consideration. Then there are the practical implementation considerations as to, even if you think it's the right thing to do, if it's not effective, you lose credibility. So, it's, you asked what practical operational implications this has, and what I can tell you is that, one of the things that our department does, because it's a central department, is it reviews every country paper that comes, both surveillance and program. It is an issue in many papers that I've seen, and we have offered advice on, what we think are some of the pros and cons of, let me mention one more thing, because the history of this is that only a few countries have used such measures. We actually have only very few examples of the types of measures. Right? We have tax on inflows, we have unremunerated reserve requirements, and then we have prudential measures. So if for the moment you set prudential measures aside and you look at price-based capital controls, you actually do not have too many, examples, of, what's the appropriate type of measure to use, which, as I mentioned at the beginning, seeks to, maximize benefits while, contains the costs. So, without, saying more about country specificity, the main point I wanted to convey, Deborah, is that this is right now very much an issue, for us. So we've, written an internal note based upon this. This is, a presentation we gave as well, and we have used this also in discussions, with country authorities.
I just want to respond. Wouldn't you count also all countries like China, for example, they don't even allow, or only under certain circumstances, foreign purchases in the stock market, the foreign, ownership of banks, for example. Those are capital controls too, aren't they? I mean, those are a lot, that's a whole separate set of controls other than what we're discussing that are extremely important. One other thing about this, because I want to address one other point here. Here's a good example. I mean, I like this diagram very much, and it does lay out the alternatives. But the problem is that, when you get into practice, for example, sterilization has a cost. Some of the capital controls that we both discussed, in Chile, for example, also in Malaysia, the controls on inflows that they had, the 90s. These were a result of, they came from them having tried sterilized intervention and they couldn't afford it. They found that they couldn't afford it because of the cost that I think you even mentioned. So, exchange rate undervalued, again, there's a whole range, you know all the difficulties in measuring whether exchange rate is overvalued and undervalued. There's going to be huge differences of opinion there, and it might suit a country's development strategy to have what the fund or other economists might consider an undervalued exchange rate. So you have all these cases where the capital controls, I think, are going to be useful, where this analysis in this paper and this analysis wouldn't necessarily say they were a good thing. And that's why I think the most important thing is the autonomy and of the countries to be able to implement the controls as they see fit. And with that, I have to say, I mean, well, your description of countries just doing whatever they want and not having to listen to the IMF is theoretically true. In the world, the failure to sign an IMF agreement can very often lead to a lack of credit elsewhere and even, in some cases, financial collapse. So there's enormous power that the fund has. It is the power, again, of its board of directors. But it is a very strong power. And that's not to say that countries can't walk away, and they do it all the time. Latin America walked away in the last decade and hasn't really come back. And same for the middle-income Asian countries after the Asian crisis. But the point is that the countries where the IMF does negotiate agreements, it's very clear from anybody who follows it that they have an enormous amount of power, and so they do shape the decision-making in a lot of countries.
I should have clarified, Mark, when I mentioned that I was referring to countries where we have a surveillance relationship.
Okay.
You know, my experiences are very much colored by also my time in the Philippines, where, you know, that's the kind of relationship we have, which in some senses is harder.
You mean the Article 4
Article
consultation
4,
zone?
right?
Okay. That's
You know, which in some senses is harder because in a program relationship, there's a whole set of factors that are going on, money is at stake, other things are going on. But if there's no money on the table, and if I have to convince you, you know, I really have to convince you by the merits of my argument.
Thank you. Well, we're just about out of time. I just want to ask our panelists if you have any other last comments either of you would like to make before we wrap up.
I do not, except I'll just say one thing, which is that, you know, Mark mentioned the concern with, you know, exchange rate appreciation. And, you know, I wanted to say that in many countries, if you see real exchange rates since the start of the crisis, they have come back to where they were before the crisis. And if these trends continue, they will, you know, then you will have more of this appreciation. Sometimes, you know, again, from my time in the Philippines, what happens to the currency is a reflection of some turnaround in the economic situation. Rather, so instead of the exchange rate affecting the economy, sometimes it is the prospects of the economy which have suddenly changed and they affect the exchange rate. And I want to give you an example that, you know, Philippines in 2005 did major reforms that put them back on investors' radar screen. There were issues, you know, these were in the fiscal and financial sector. There was, you know, associated with a marked turnaround in investor sentiment. The period that ensued was a period where Philippines grew strongly, if you look at the data, and had exchange rate appreciation. But, you know, this appreciation was a reflection of a shift and improvement in investors' perceptions of the country. And you know, when the exchange rate does appreciate, right? And it went from, was something like 56 pesos to the dollar to at one point 39 pesos to the dollar. You can imagine that it has a big impact on exporters. And so this was, you know, very much an issue that, you know, the authorities were struggling with. Exchange rate, whether it's overvalued or not, is tough. You can have economic theory to help you, to guide you, but it only goes up to a certain level. Then you have to use judgment. At the end of the day, then you can also, you have to make a decision. So, you use whatever information you have, and then you try to decide how, whether it's gone too much or whether it has gone too much. So I just wanted to sort of mention sort of the two-way relationship between the impact of exchange rates on the economy and sometimes the impact of, the economy and perceptions of the economy on the exchange rate. But more than that, I wanted to thank you also for the opportunity for this discussion, and look forward to other venues and other opportunities for such engagement.
Thank you. I would like to, I'm glad you brought those issues up, because I think that is something that I wanted to address. First, with regard to exchange rates, I mentioned that stability is also part of the question. Again, we've only been talking, and this paper only talks about overvaluation and undervaluation, or at least that's the emphasis. And I would say a stable exchange rate, a stable and competitive real exchange rate, but the stability part is also important, as well as being competitive, because any kind of investment, any kind of planning, you have to have some idea what the prices are going to be. You look at the inflation targeting regimes like Brazil, you look at what's happened to their exchange rate, it's very volatile, it's hugely volatile, and I think that's hurt them a lot. And so this is another reason why I think capital controls are important, because it's hard enough, it's very hard for the central bank who even targets the exchange rate. And that is another point I maybe should have emphasized more, is that, because that's another thing that came out of the Rethinking Macroeconomics paper that your chief economist co-authored, Prudential. He acknowledged for the first time that I've seen from the fund that central banks should in fact say that they are targeting, some central banks, that they are targeting the exchange rate. That's, I think the words he used were that central banks should acknowledge that the exchange rate is part of their objective function. Targeting exchange rate is part of their objective function. So that, I think, is very, very important, because in reality, all kinds of central banks do that in developing countries, and even the ones that are supposedly floating exchange rate inflation targeting regimes are targeting it. And so that is where capital controls are going to be really important. And finally, on the whole issue of one other thing I didn't mention that I should have, again, your former IMF economist, Arvind Subramanian, did a couple of papers is looking at the relationship between foreign capital inflows and growth, and didn't really find a positive relationship. And that's consistent, I think, with the literature on exchange rates and growth. That is, to the extent that foreign capital inflows appreciate the exchange rate, and appreciated or overvalued exchange rates are associated with lower growth and development outcomes, you would expect that result as well. Now again, we don't have a lot of literature on it, but it should be enough to make people skeptical of whether we should really worry too much about capital controls being an impediment to foreign portfolio investment. I want to thank you again also, and both of you, and I hope we do have further discussion.
Thanks everyone for coming. I especially would like to thank Reza Baqir for sharing his time, and I think it is important during these civil society policy forums that we actually have discussions like this between civil society and actual staff at the IMF to contribute to the debate. I'm sorry that we didn't get time for more questions, but I'm sure that our speakers will be happy to stay after, hopefully, and answer some, and I hope that this is the beginning of this discussion as we see the importance now coming out from the paper of capital controls in the of our discussions with IMF on this. So thank you all very much.